So it wasn't all that long ago where I showed this tweet right here, and we had a discussion, right, about what it would take to create a future dated message. Now, I also posted this video which talked about the architecture of everything, but as a lot of you know on this channel, we don't like to just deal in the theory. We want to go ahead and get down to building this thing. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Michael Liendo. I go by Focus Otter everywhere because I like to focus on fun, creative solutions to building out your full stack cloud-powered applications. So if you like today's content, consider subscribing as it really does help the channel out. Okay, let's go ahead and get into it. All right, so here's a quick refresher. We have a React application, and then we have our users sign in to certain points of our application that are protected via Amazon Cognito. Now, to make any API requests, we're going to be leveraging AWS AppSync behind the scenes. Granted, in our code, you won't really notice that we're using AppSync, but AppSync is going to have a couple of responsibilities. First one is going to be managing all of our CRUD operations. That's the easy part. Amplify handles all of that. However, we want to extend that. The default CRUD operations that Amplify gives us isn't enough. So how do we make our own custom mutations? In this case, we're going to have one endpoint, create scheduled message, and it's going to do two things: create a message and schedule a message. Now, as I mentioned, Amplify will already give us the ability to create a message, but we don't want to use that. We're going to be creating our own because we want another operation to happen from there. So we're going to create our own message. And then when it gets done being created, instead of coming back to the front end, we're just going to keep that journey going. When the item gets saved into DynamoDB, trigger the next part of our operation, which is going to be scheduling a message with EventBridge Scheduler. If you haven't used that before, it's a fantastic service, purposely built for scenarios like this. So we're going to pass it a time zone, a schedule, the message details, etc. And a Lambda function is going to be triggered at that time, which will then trigger an email through the use of Amazon SES. This is really great because a lot of email providers don't give you the ability to set a scheduled message, whether that is email or if it's something like text with Twilio. And you can easily substitute out this ending portion to say, instead of an email, send a text message or do whatever it is that you want to do at a later date. Now we have the UI in place here. Honestly, let's not go over that. Let me just show you what we have in terms of the starter files that I put together. So here is our application. It's going to be Focus Otter Scheduler. And inside of here, we can easily get started. You can see a little bit of the details for this application. Again, repo and everything is in the description. But we will eventually have a view messages section. Now, the star of the show isn't going to be the ability to list out the messages. Again, that's just an API request. We are going to be focusing on the star of the show, which is going to be the ability to create a new message, just like how we see here in this form. Now, this needs to be protected. We don't want anybody to just come into our application and start scheduling messages. And the messages for our use cases are just going to be sent to the email address they used to log in. Feel free to modify it if you have a different use case. So we're using Amplify Gen 2, we're extending it with custom operations, and then we are branching out to use other services that Amplify just doesn't provide out of the box, like EventBridge Scheduler. It's going to be pretty full packed. So in that case, let's just go ahead and get started. So here we are, a quick overview of the code. Again, we're using Vite in this application to kind of boilerplate everything out. And we have multiple pages, right? So we have React Router DOM being used. I'm doing this because hopefully I can transition to Remix later down the road. But we have 3 pages set up. We have the home page that we've seen, our messages page, and then the ability to schedule a message page. This is really going to be the one that we're focusing on, in which case we have a message form that we can use, and it's just a really basic form. Nothing crazy going on here. Now, where are we going to kick things off? First and foremost, we should probably get Amplify set up from the get-go. This isn't anything too crazy. It's a little bit simpler than Amplify Gen 1, where we just say npm create and then amplify at latest. This is going to create a Amplify directory, and within that, it'll provision out 2 services. One is going to be an auth resource, and the other one is going to be our data resource. Note that they don't use the AWS service names because it doesn't really matter. It's all TypeScript at the end of the day. Now with that installed, before I get out of my terminal, I want to go ahead and make sure that I install the Amplify libraries because we do want that built-in authenticator for us. So AWS Amplify /UI-React will do the job for us. And this gives us the easy way to have authentication set up in our app. Now, if you haven't used Gen 2 before, let's just take a peek at what gets delivered to us out of the box. We have the ability to sign in with email, but we can switch this up. And if we wanted to go phone, set that to true and delete email. It's up to you, but email makes sense for our application here. From here, we can check out the resource category. This is where we're going to be spending some time initially because we have to tweak this. Right now it's set up for a to-do application. We are going to set this up for a message application. And nothing too crazy. The fields aren't all that bad. Instead of watching me type it out, I'm just going to paste it in so we can talk about it. We're going to swap that to-do for a message. That message is going to have the following fields: a title, which is a required string, a message, same thing, a delivery date. I do want to point this one out because there is a date time field, but that includes the time zone. Now we could use this, but it gives you the Z at the end with the comment that I have here. That's going to give you something like Z, basically. And because of that, EventBridge Scheduler doesn't need this because it has its own time zone field, which is going to be something like America, Chicago, in our case, where I'm at. All that to say, we're going to keep this as a string right down here. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we have the time zone as well. Now, we only want people who sign up for our application to be able to schedule messages for themselves. I can't schedule a message for you and vice versa. So we have this allow owner field in terms of authorization. Now, in terms of cleanup, because this is a fresh Amplify project, I'm going to delete some of this commented stuff up here and then delete the steps down here. Notice that we give you a lot of details on how to get started with your application. And we're not using IAM permissions as a default. We're going to be using Cognito, which is going to be under this user pool key right here. That's the lovely thing about this, is that I don't have to guess if it's Cognito or if it's user pool. I can use IntelliSense because TypeScript is just throughout this entire application. Speaking of using IntelliSense, I'm going to come down here and I know that there is a name field. I'm just going to name my API. Otherwise, it's going to be something generic like Amplify Data. I want this to be something like YouTube Scheduler. And with that in place, I can come over here and deploy my application to AWS simply by running the command npx ampx, and then sandbox will get me there. I specifically have a profile that I use, so I'm going to set this up to my YouTube profile. If you don't have one, don't pass that part in. I'll check in with you when it's done. So I'm going to set up authentication. I think that's probably the next best step. So let's get rid of this sidebar, open up our file explorer, and then we can head over to our page here. So we can come over here. You can see that we do in fact have a Amplify output. So this is going to be our config. We can bypass that for now. Let's go to our pages. Inside of the pages, we'll go to our scheduled messenger, and I'm simply going to wrap this in a with authenticator. This is enough to get the authentication component set up, but none of the styles will be applied. Let's tweak that by heading over to our main page, and then we could import, everything that we need to get Amplify set up. First up are going to be the styles. So let's get that taken care of. There we go. And then next up, we probably want to configure Amplify to begin with. So we'll get Amplify in there. Thank you, Amazon Q. And then we'll configure it by bringing in the exports. This is actually going to be maybe one more, and it's going to be the Amplify outputs. And then we'll configure everything together. Cool. Just missing a slash there. And I think now we're good to go. Let's preview this in our browser. That's huge. A little bit smaller. Great. Heading over to Focus Auto Scheduler. Our home page, we can click on create a new message, and we're looking pretty good. Let's just go ahead and create an account just to make sure everything is working just fine. So mtliendo@focusauto.com, pass in my social security number, double it up, and then I should be getting a code sent to my email. Okay, just got my code. We are working with 456296 today. Click confirm up here, and we should be taken back to our application. There we go. So we have a user in place, right? This is looking great. And I'm just going to keep this user logged in. Now, this is actually a good pro tip, which is when you come over here and we're in our application of the scheduled message, when you have your application wrapped in a with authenticator, you automatically get two properties. You automatically get the user, and you get a sign out function that you can call. So this will have details on the user. This is a function you can call, pass it to your nav bar or whatever you have going on. And if you're wondering what the typings are, this is just going to be a prop with a user on it. And this is going to be an auth user from Amplify. And then in here, we have sign out, which is going to be just a regular function that doesn't really return anything, just like that. So here are the types in case you want to use them. This is just complaining because they're not being used so far. So we have all of our CRUD operations set up. We have authentication set up working with email. If we were just now a regular to-do style application, we'd be pretty much done. But in our case, we want to extend this so that when a user creates a message or creates a schedule, that will be scheduled so that they can get it down the road. In short, we have to enhance our API. So heading back over to our data resource, let's check this out real quick. Data, We have our CRUD operations here. How do we extend this beyond what Amplify gives us? We just create a new type. And in my case, I'm going to call this create message schedule. Types. The key thing is that it's not a model. In our case, it's going to be something different. It's a mutation. Now this mutation is still going to have arguments on. Now let me clean this up just a little bit so it looks like this. And then we can have arguments. These arguments are going to be pretty much the same thing as what we have above. So I can pretty much copy those and bring them over here. And then we have to specify what is this thing going to return. In our case, we really just care about if you return a success message or not. So let's just make our lives easy and say that it returns a string. Now in the future, I might want to tweak this. So let's just make it a custom type, basically an object. And this object can contain a string type. Great. So when we read this back to ourselves, we have the ability to create a message. This is a new point and a new endpoint on our API. It's going to be a mutation. Awesome. We have arguments and we know what it's returning. Now we just need to specify the business logic. What are the steps used to accomplish this task? All we have to do on our end is give it a handler. Now I'm just going to paste in what we have here. It's a handler. And we specify the steps using an array, which are going to dictate the order. But this handler is going to contain our business logic. The first one is going to be the ability to create a message. This is the file that is going to do so. We haven't created it yet. Now this create message function is going to reference the data source known as message. What is message? It's just the database that got created by Amplify, specified by this key right here. If this message was called to do instead, we would say to do down here. We're just referencing it. So the first step is just to create this message. This is going to be our own thing. This isn't anything Amplify specific. We're going off the beaten path and we have to dictate what happens inside of this create message flow. You'll see what I mean when we get there. So we need the ability to say continue on after you create that message. Now, a lot of you might be thinking, oh yeah, this is where I would use a DynamoDB stream, which is a Lambda function, and we can kick things off from there. You don't have to do that here. Now you can just continue on with the pipeline. You don't need a Lambda function in this case. The next step that we're going to have is the ability to schedule a message. After you create it, schedule it. And this is really going to be sort of the prime point of this entire video. How do you schedule this message? Now to schedule a message, you do have to be logged into the application. So let's just tack on some authorization to say, hey, you got to be signed in, right? So to review what we have so far, right? Everything that Amplify creates, the default CRUD operations and all that good stuff comes from right here. In our case, we want to extend it. We have a create message schedule endpoint, which is going to be a mutation. Here are the arguments, pretty much the same thing as what gets passed in up here. Actually, exactly the same thing. It's going to return just a string, give me a little success message, letting me know that everything went fine. And then how are we constituting that business logic? It's going to be a create message file with the data source, which is matching the same data source as our message up here. And then we have the handler, which is going to be in charge of scheduling the message, which is this part right here. We're calling this data source EvSchedule DS. And you'll see why it's important to not get this mixed up, rewritten, different casing, etc. as we define these files out. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to kick things off with our create message.js file. So we'll come over here, create this file, create message.js. Now, if you've seen my CDK starter videos or that repo or that blog post, etc., you know how to do this part, but just bring everybody up to speed. Let's just paste in the code and then talk about it. Now, this is a JavaScript resolver. AppSync will give you a utils within the runtime. We don't have to install this package. So we already have this in place. And then we have a request and response. The request is what is going to DynamoDB. And then the response is what DynamoDB gives back to us. In our scenario, we are going to pull off the context.identity, specifically the username and the sub. Now, because we're signing in with an email, our username and our sub are actually the same thing. They're both like the Cognito ID, right? I'm just showing you what happens here when you pull these off. Now we're creating a message, so we need a unique ID. Essentially, we're mirroring what Amplify creates on our behalf. So if you're wondering what happens behind the scenes, this is what happens. We're going to use this util to create the ID. We're going to use a time util, again, provided by the AppSync package, to create a created at and updated at time. You can see it's called now, and I'm specifying this down here. We'll get to more of that in a second. And then the owner. This is why I pull off the sub and the username, even though I know that they're the same thing. But because Amplify specifically uses this format, sub:username, for all of their owner operations. You can check it out in the docs. I'll leave that in the description as well. But this is how Amplify knows who is an owner. Now for the title, I'm just going to keep as like context.args.title. So let me just copy this and then get rid of all of this right here. You'll see why I'm doing this in just a little bit, but all I have to do is specify the title here. Now it's yelling at me saying that the ID is being used. See, I'm finding all kinds of mistakes in here. Let's just go ahead and pass in the ID right there. So we have these fields in here, right? And this is what we're passing as a created item. Now, because I know how Amplify does things, if you ever look at the DynamoDB table, it will give you _ type name, which is a GraphQL way of doing things, which is the same name as whatever the data source is. In our case, message, that's lining with this message field right up here. Those will always be the same. So we pass it the key that we're looking to increase, and then we also just put the item inside of DynamoDB. DynamoDB is going to respond, assuming this all went well, with a context.result, which equals the item that got put into DynamoDB. So I could do context.result dot title, owner, etc. Great. And again, I have a bunch of videos that show this exact flow. So if maybe that was a little bit too fast for you, feel free to check out some of those other videos and it'll make a lot more sense. Now, creating the actual schedule, that's going to be the fun part. So let's create a schedule message.js file, and then we can see what's going on in there in terms of working with EventBridge Scheduler. So we have this in place, and then over here, I can paste in the code that we're going to have. You can see that we're working with 35 lines of code. And we're going to walk through this before we get too far into it. And I do have to tweak this line because I switched things up in the previous file. So first and foremost, we're going to log out the identity. This is coming from Cognito. It's specific to however they authenticated. So it doesn't have to be Cognito stuff, but in our case it is, because we signed our users in. And we're doing some validation. We're saying, hey, only hit this up if we have a successful response. How do we know we have a successful response? It's going to be if the previous function that ran has a .result.id. Again, that's coming from DynamoDB. So if you have an ID from that saved field, great. But if you don't, then go ahead and return early, meaning kick out of this function and respond with the error message. We couldn't save anything. Otherwise, now we're in EventBridge Schedule land. Now this is a different format from our DynamoDB function that we just saw, right? This is a create message, and we're going to say ddb.put. Over here, we're now going to say this is our resource path with a method and params, and how the hell do we know that it needs all of these things? Before we talk about that, let me fix this one line over here where I can say const title, and we'll set that equal to that one part that we had over here. So I think it was here. So let's clean that up. And then instead of passing in this ID, we can just do some really ugly coding by saying it's the context.previous functions result.id. And I'm doing all of that so that over here, I can have a title. So I'm saving the actual title in DynamoDB, and this resource path needs a unique endpoint. So then I'm going to create the title plus whatever the Cognito sub is. You might be asking, like, Michael, why are you doing all this? How do you know to do all of this stuff? I'm a wizard, obviously. Actually, what I'm doing is I am using the documentation provided by EventBridge Scheduler. Let me show you what I mean. If I come over here and I say, hey, I want to create a schedule, click on this, and you can see that the create schedule endpoint, blow this up a little bit for you. For EventBridge Scheduler, this is just documentation I'll leave into the show notes here. It's a post request. It's the /schedules endpoint, and it needs a unique name, which is why I extrapolated that title. And then this is the body that you need. Now, here's the part that sucks. Here's what I don't like. You have to click through if you've never used it before. You got to click through and see, are you required or not? So you can scroll down here and pick out the ones that are required, or you can come down here and see what are the key points. So let's talk about this for just a second. When this schedule gets done, do you want this schedule to linger around, or do you want it to automatically delete? Most of the times for one-off schedules, you want it to delete. Next up, you have a client token. This is in case it has like retries or it's trying to do something else. It's idempotent. It has to be unique keys, so that way if it tries to do things over again, it can. You can give it a description if you want. When is this going to end? This is for recurring messages. This isn't for the sort of when is this actually going to be completed time. Flexible time window. If you want this to be completed at 10:30, is it okay if they say 10:30 is a busy time? Could we do 10:35? So this is a yes or a no in terms of the window that you have. You can group your messages. You can do all kinds of other things. We're not going to go through every option here. The ones that we care about are the time zone. You can toggle the state of things as enabled or disabled. You can give it a timestamp from when it can be invoked. And then the field that we care about the most is going to be the target. I guess there's a couple that are important, but never mind. All of this stuff we don't actually need. We need the ARN of the target. Right? In our case, it's going to be a Lambda function, so we have to pass Lambda functions ARN. In addition, all of this like KMS stuff, network stuff, placement strategy, doesn't matter for our use case. If we're going to EventBridge, which is something you can absolutely do, you can pass in that stuff. We don't need that. Kinesis, don't need it. Retries, again, why that item potency key is so important. In case it were to fail, are we going to retry this event? We don't need that in this use case. Role ARN is something very tricky. We will talk about it when we get there. I don't know, a minute. But you absolutely need this. And it's very important that you understand the permissioning around this. Again, we're almost to talking about that point. But we have to pass a role to this. Yes, it is required. This is in addition to the ARN of whatever service we're calling. Again, a Lambda function in our case. SageMaker pipelines, SQS parameters, don't need it. You want to dive into more of these features, feel free to scroll down. Again, I'll leave the documentation in the notes below. But with that whirlwind out of the way, now we can go back into our code and we can see what we have. We have that post request, the resource path, the headers, application JSON. When you get done, go ahead and delete yourself. When is this going to run? The schedule expression is going to be at a specific time, which is going to be the delivery date that we specified. The time zone is the user's time zone. ID, no flexible window. And then the most important part, what are we going to be invoking? It's going to be the ARN of our function. Notice I'm using environment variables here. You'll see why as we get to there. And what I love about this is after we specify the ARN of the function, the role that the function can do, but we can also specify what fields get passed in as the event. In our case, we want it to be event dot and then the message ID. So that way it can look up the item inside of DynamoDB. And then we also want to specify the user's email. Now, technically, I think we're passing in the email already. And once all of that gets done, we have the response here. Feel free to dive into this if you wanted to log it out inside of the UI or just the AWS console. And then we're going to return this object with a message type of string right here. So looking back at our architecture, seeing if everything is matching to what we said we were going to be building today, we have this part done, right? Cognito login set. Our API has these two functions within this pipeline, where the first one is going to be creating the message. The second one is going to be scheduling the message for later on. Now, the later on part is already set, is dictated by whatever the user put in terms of the arguments. Now, we need to say, let's pass in, or rather, let's invoke a Lambda function that can send an email. Now, if you checked out my last two videos where we're heading with this part, it's not the hardest thing to do, but getting this connection in place where EventBridge, or rather AppSync, has the ability to call EventBridge, which can then call our function, that's going to be the tricky part. Fortunately, you're watching this video, so I'm going to break that all down for you. So back over in our application, we need to create that Lambda function, right? So let's come over here to Amplify, and we're going to create a new file. This is going to be within a functions directory, and we're just going to call send email, which is pretty much what this function is going to be doing. Now, send email is going to be the folder that contains everything. And as is true with all of AWS services inside of Amplify, we need to set up a resource.ts file for it. Now, this part is a cakewalk. We just come in here and we're like, hey, I want to define a function. We're going to give it a name, and we're going to say that the name is called send SES email function. And the entry point for this is going to be main.ts. So let's create that file real quick. So we'll say main.ts. And then now we can specify everything that needs to happen inside of this function. Now let's think about this for a little bit. We know when we scheduled this function that we are passing the message ID and the user email. So the event.message ID and user email are there. So if I come over here and I paste in something like this, then great, I have the fields that I need, right? And then you got to like visualize with me here. I need this function to grab an item from DynamoDB. You're like, cool, no problem. Now, here's the thing. You can try to have a function just called DynamoDB, right? But in a real world application, you oftentimes want to be notified in your client application when that message successfully gets fired. When that message gets invoked, then you want to be listening to that in your client side application. Now we get into the beauty of WebSockets, real-time data. You can't just fire something and forget it. You need oftentimes in real world applications, a way to be notified in real time, again, when all of that stuff occurs. How do you do that? The really cool thing about AppSync, the API layer that we're using, is that we specify this as a mutation. Now, anytime a mutation gets invoked, any client application can subscribe to those changes. So simply by calling this, we have subscriptions enabled. And all we have to do is make sure that we call that mutation inside of our function, instead of calling DynamoDB directly. Now let's be real here. We're outside the scope of Amplify. right? We're in a Lambda function. We're doing our own thing. We have to reset up Amplify. And turns out it's not that bad. In fact, the documentation has all this stuff for you. I'm going to create a new file called configure amplify. And inside of this file, I'm going to bring in everything that we need. Now notice what we have here. I have an environment variable, which is used to bring in any of the environment variables that this function has access to that Amplify provides to us. We'll get back to this in a second. I'm going to bring in the Amplify libraries already installed, and then I'm just going to reconfigure Amplify with everything that is available to it. The region, the off mode, etc. And then we also have secret keys and access keys based off of the session that we're in. Again, this is all within the Amplify documentation, and in fact, it's copy paste across projects. But as you can see, I have this red squiggly, which is not giving us access to the environment. And it's because it's only available if we hook this up to our AppSync API, our data resource. We could fix that pretty easily by going back over to our data resource and saying, hey, on my API, I want my Lambda function to have the ability to make a query against this API. So I can tack on a .authorization rule. We can bring in our function right down here. And once I import this, now we have the ability to query. And because I have my sandbox open, I can come over here and see all the errors that were happening along the way. And in fact, you can see that it's still not liking some validation. Hey, you named this a generic like message scheduler endpoint, probably while I was developing. Did you mean to call it your YouTube schedule GraphQL endpoint? I sure did. I'm going to grab this over here. And a cool little way to check this is that if you come to this .amplify folder and click down into your environment, you can see the specific function listed right here. And down here, you can see at the very bottom, your Amplify specific backend environment variables. So we have this right here. I'm going to switch this over to what I had previously. So in my environment, I can tweak this to be that YouTube message scheduler, and all is right in the world. If I look at my sandbox environment, it's going to redeploy this function to AWS, and everything should be working. Now I was deploying and then it blew up. I was checking out the logs and I was wondering what was happening. And it turns out it's giving me all the clues that I need here. It's like, hey, your mutation, your message schedule portion of it is not working. We don't know what you're trying to access. And that makes complete sense because even though part one of it is accessing the message table that we created, part two is trying to access EventBridge Scheduler, but we never set that up. We wrote the business logic and we assigned it on our API, but we never actually created that EventBridge Schedule data source, that EB schedule DS value that I told you we would talk about and then I forgot about. So let's fix that. And that's okay because once we get done filling out this main function inside of our Lambda, we can go ahead and assign that data source and make everything right in the world. So if I'm here and then I head back over to my main file, now we can start making this a little bit more interesting than just this default hello world. In fact, I can say await and then I can set up Amplify. So we have this right here. I'm going to await that. And now with Amplify set up, we can start to generate our client. Now the generate client function is provided to us by Amplify. So I can come over here, have this generate client function imported, and I do need to give it the path for my schema. This is going to be super helpful for making sure that we get IntelliSense on all of our operations. So I come over here and simply import this. And because I am in the context of a Lambda function and not Cognito, aka my front-end application, then I specify the auth mode as IAM. Now, when I'm accessing a model inside of my front-end application, I can use things like client dot and then say things like models, and it knows everything about the operations on here. Again, thanks to being passed in the schema. However, I'm not in a client-side application and I'm using a custom mutation. So I want to say something like client.graphql. And then if you've used Amplify Gen 1 or done this before, that you can pass it an object and specify the query that you're working with, along with any variables as well. So we can do something like this and then pass in variables. Now in our case, the query is going to be the ability to get that item from DynamoDB, and the variable is going to be the ID of the item that we're trying to get. However, we haven't written this get message operation. And if I'm being honest, I don't want to. I want Amplify to automatically look at my schema and provide all that information to me. And surely enough, as you might have anticipated, the React team has thought about this stuff. So you can come over here and have all of that generated on your behalf, simply by specifying this command right here, npx, and then generate the GraphQL client code. Now, the one thing you want to specify is the function path that you're working with, specifically right here. I'm going to tweak this so that it outputs a GraphQL directory inside of my function code. Awesome. I got that GraphQL file created for us rather than that directory. So let's get out of here. And then I can now have the ability to reference that within my application. So for this query, I can say something like get message. You can see that it's coming from ./GraphQL queries. Is an easy way to get all of my queries generated, just like any Amplify project. And it knows what variables need to be passed in, specifically the ID right here. Now this is going to be coming from the message ID field. And what I'll do now that I have that is just assign that to a data property. So I can say const data equals this value right here. And I'm pretty sure I can just extrapolate data field that is on here. Now, if I peek, this should have all of the items from my request. So if I say data dot and peep into this more, I'm not seeing any fields on here. Let's do some live debugging. And I bet I need to await this. And now we can say data. Okay, cool. Get message dot, all of that stuff. Man, I love TypeScript sometimes. Awesome. So we have the data, which is going to contain the title, body, everything that we need to be able to send this off in an email. But I don't know about you, but I'm getting really tired of having my application roll back because my function isn't hooked up to my API just yet. So before we work on the sending email portion, let's go ahead and get all of that stuff configured correctly. First and foremost, over in my backend file, I can say, hey, here's my backend Amplify file. I want to bring in that function. Awesome. This will get our function wired up to our application, but we have a bunch of permissions that we need to specify to get this all taken care of. First and foremost, let's just go ahead and pull off our backend variable that we get from this defined backend function right here. And let's get the easy parts out of the way. Our function needs the ability to send an email via SES. So we can bring in a policy statement, and this will add that policy to the role for this function. So far, so good. Now, other two actions that this needs, it needs the ability to send an email. And then I honestly just always throw on the send raw email. Because that's there, I can switch things up and send it as HTML this time, but maybe send it as a raw HTML next time. Check out my other videos if you want to see more on how to send emails with attachments versus having them in the body. Now we get to the fun part. Remember in our backend data / resource file, we have this EB scheduler.ds, right? Let's go ahead and create that by specifying this right here. So AppSync has a DynamoDB data source. That's just what it's called. Your API can connect to something, and that something is DynamoDB. AppSync, our data resource, can also connect to any arbitrary HTTP endpoint, including AWS resources. How do you specify an AWS resource? Just like this. You pass it the endpoint, and let's maybe segue, 30 seconds to talk about this real quick. If you have this bookmarked, and you should, then you can easily find out which endpoints you're working with. Let me pull up that file real quick. And it's going to be this right here. I'll put it inside of the docs. It's super handy to have just so that you can look it up really quickly. I'm going to look for a scheduler. Here's EventBridge Scheduler right here. And it has all of these service endpoints that you're going to need. We're in US East 1, so I use this one right here with HTTPS. Super handy. I'll put it in the description. So that way you have it. You can name this one whatever you want. Just make sure it matches what you have in your data file. And then here's the endpoint. This much is going to be pretty much the same everywhere you go. You have an auth config and you break apart this URL. US East 1 scheduler is oftentimes, not always, but 99% of the time, just this first portion right here. Great. And now this is a data source on our API. And this data source has the ability to have actions and roles and things like that applied to it. In this case, this data source needs the ability to create an EventBridge schedule. So keep in mind, our DynamoDB data source has the ability to talk to and use this file, but our EventBridge data source, which is this one right here, needs the ability to create an EventBridge schedule. So let's just give it that permission real quick. Here is the ability. We already have the policy function included, and it's scheduler create schedule. And keep in mind that when we looked at that create schedule documentation, maybe we can pull that up real quick. The EventBridge scheduler role needs to have certain permissions applied to it, right? What is this schedule going to target? So as we give it a role, I can sort of look up that role right here. We're going to need to give it the ARN. So we have to create the role and then pass the ARN to it. What permissions does this need? Well, it has to call a Lambda function. So we should probably give it permission to do so. I'm going to set this right here. Here's our scheduler role. And now we just have some imports that we have to configure. So I'm going to do this just like this. What I love about this is that it's straight up CDK. What I hate about this is that it's straight up CDK, right? It's the best and worst of both worlds. So if you're used to creating a role, this is nothing. And if you're not, it probably looks a little intimidating. Fortunately, TypeScript makes this all pretty safe and simple. When we create the new role, it's going to be a part of the stack of this stack. So put it in the same stack as my other resources. We can give it a name. This is arbitrary, and it is going to be used by our scheduler service. What are the policies, aka the actions that it can use? We need to give it the ability to invoke our Lambda function. Which Lambda function? This Lambda function. That's how that whole thing reads. So keep in mind that EventBridge Scheduler has the ability to invoke our Lambda function. What is cool is that when it does so, it can give an arbitrary role to that Lambda function. That way you can have dynamic permissions. But what that means for us is that our data source, our EventBridge data source that we created up here, is going to call our scheduler, and the scheduler is going to call our Lambda, meaning it has to pass additional permissions to our Lambda function. All that to say, when it comes to this role ARN, right? This is the role that you need to pass. Anytime you see another service passing a role to another service, that is an additional permission. I know it gets crazy. Fortunately, all we have to do is specify this right here. Okay, it's called a pass role permission, and we're going to grant that to our data source. So our EventBridge data source has the ability to invoke EventBridge Scheduler, and our scheduler data source can pass this role. All we need to do from here is pass some environment variables to our API. Specifically, here is the schedule functions role, and here is the ARN. These are going to be used within our function. We've already seen that inside of here when we get down to our context.env, and then the ARN, and then the functions role. You can pass those, but unless you have that pass role permission on here, it would throw an error. Phew. And with that in place, let's head back over to our terminal. It is trying to synthesize and get everything pushed up. It's looking like everything is successful, meaning I think we're finally in a good spot to finish off the business logic inside of our Lambda function and test this thing out. And it looks like from here, we're in a pretty good spot. So we'll come over to our function. Inside of our function, we'll head over to our main file. We have the data coming from DynamoDB. We can verify that with IntelliSense and say get message.yada. In my case, I'm just going to send the HTML email. Now we haven't created this file yet. I'm going to tuck this away in a utils directory inside of the send email folder. So utils/send HTML email. And then inside of here, now we have our business logic. We do have a library that we have to install. It's going to be this AWS SDK. Again, I hate to keep saying this, but my last two videos covered all of this, but I have a function here. I use this across a bunch of my projects. It's all parameterized for me, where I'm going to bring in a from email address. Who is this message going to? What is the subject? And then pass in the HTML. I'm using HTML in the use case. And then I construct that as the params. So I bring in these values, put it in as params, and then down here, now I construct the function call, and then finally send this API request off. I get a console.log if things went through. I get a console.log if things didn't work. But the main thing is that over here, I can now import this function in, save this up, and you can see that we have the from address. This is a verified SES identity. And then I have the two addresses, an array with just a single email, going to be the user's email. What is the subject? It's going to be the title. What is the body? It's going to be an H1 saying, here is your message, and here is the content. With that in place, I can give this a save. And I think the last thing to do is to just test this thing out. I know this video is getting long, so let's just head over to our form. And inside of our form, notice that we have all of these input values with a name associated with them. So we have names on the title, message, date, and time zone. I'm going to make an API request on the submit right in here. So we'll say on submit. We'll give it a function right inside of here. Of course, we'll do the typical e.prevent default. But we'll see how far Amazon Q can help us out here. We have all of these fields inside of here. We can get the title, the message, the date, and the time zone, just like that. And then right up top, I can import my client and my schema similar to how we did in our Lambda function. And then I can generate my client. The cool thing is that down here, I have all these values intact. So I can say something like client dot, oh, whoops, looks like I'm outside of my function here. We can say client dot, and then bring in the mutation that we're working with. The specific mutation is going to be create message schedule. And then inside of here, we can pass in the params that we're working with. And I do get IntelliSense on all of these fields. So I can just hit enter as Amazon Q again, helps me out there. I might have gone one level too deep with the input. So let's get rid of this right here. And there we go. And I'm getting some red squigglies on these. It looks like some of them could be null. All I'm going to do is come over here. I'm just going to mark them all as string values to get rid of that right there. Note that delivery date is going to be the date. I can tweak the name if I wanted to. I don't really want to. So with all that in place, I can say const response is going to equal this right here. And then we can simply console.log out the response. And before I forget, I better mark this as an await. Otherwise, I'm going to get a nasty little syntax error in there. And the only way this is going to work is if I mark this as await right here. We can check things out just to verify we're getting what we need. Response.data. You can see that inside of there. I'm going to keep it as response so I can keep track of any errors that might have propagated. Okay, I think we're in a good spot to test this. Let's go over to our application. We can come up here and I want to do a couple of things. First and foremost, let's get logged into our AWS account here. And inside of this, I want to head over to EventBridge Scheduler because I want to make sure that event is actually being created. So in EventBridge Scheduler, I can go over to my schedules. Inside of here, I can kind of bump this up so we all can see it. And I should get a schedule here. What time do we have right now? 32. Let's go ahead and push this off to 34 in our UI. So we'll go here. We can say the title is going to be Hello World. Enter a message. Such a great time doing this tut. And I have 1 minute left. So let's get this in today at, oh my goodness, what time is it? 12:34. There we go. Submit. Let me check out the inspector in the console. The response message successfully sent. That is awesome. Let's go over to EventBridge. I'm kind of hurrying right now. Verify. We do have a message that was scheduled. It is going to invoke our Lambda function. Great. We are almost here. And there we go. I'm not going to show you the actual email portion because I know it's going to go into my junk folder and I have a ton of junk in that folder. But trust me, the fact that our Lambda function got invoked and that the message got cleared out is a pretty good indication that it did get sent over to my folder. Let me know what you thought about this project, how easy, how difficult, how crazy it was to get this all put together. Hopefully, if anything, it made it seem doable and achievable by following these steps. The full repo is down in the description. So if you have any questions, comments, concerns, hit me up on socials. Otherwise, file an issue and I can get in touch with you there. This was a super fun project to put together. So thank you for Florian for sharing it in the first place. And thank me for putting it together. Thank you all for joining. My name is Michael Liendo. Again, I go by Focus Honor everywhere. And I'll catch you all next time. Peace.